Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102 Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 7, where we're going to take a look at issues in policing. So, as usual, we have a lot of content to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right into our lectures. But let's start with some of the learning objectives. So, we want to kind of take a look at some of the changes in the structure and composition of America's police forces over time. Describe some of the reasons why experts believe police have a somewhat unique culture and personality. And just to kind of get a little bit ahead of myself, they do. Next, to be able to recognize the different types of police officer styles, identify factors that influence some of the police discretion issues, discuss the issues of racial profiling, recognize the consequences of stress and fatigue and how that kind of fits in, take a look at use of force, brutality, and corruption, and distinguish between the three, explain the difference between deadly and non-deadly force, and then finally kind of look at some of the leading types of less than lethal weapons that are out there as it relates to use of force. So again, Chapter 7, issues in policing. So, the composition of the nation's police forces is really changing. And traditionally, police agencies were composed of or comprised of white males with a high school education who basically looked at policing as a secure position with a lot of, tradition, if you will. And because of that, it was not really uncommon to see, police families in which one member of each generation would enter law enforcement or some type of criminal justice or first responder type, position. And this picture has really been kind of changing, and it really is going to continue to change as criminal justice programs turn out thousands of graduates every year. An increasing number of police officers, are going to start to have at least some college education, and I really think that you should. Okay, and I'll explain why in a little bit. And in addition to that, affirmative action programs have helped slowly change the racial and gender composition of police agencies to reflect a better community makeup. Again, in recent years, many departments and many experts have argued that police recruits should have a college education, and this development really isn't unexpected considering that a higher education, in the hiring and promotion process is growing. So in order to kind of move up, you're going to need more college, possibly a degree, etc. And again, we'll take a little bit of a look at that in a few minutes. So, although most law enforcement agencies still do not require recruits to have necessarily an advanced degree. Now, that's a recruit, somebody at the very beginning, right? The number requiring some higher education in the hiring and especially the promotion process is continuing to grow. And today, nearly all local police agencies require at least a high school diploma and even a little bit more, if you will, for new officer recruits. Now, a couple of numbers considering when this textbook was done, which was a few years ago, but about 32% of departments have some type of college requirement. About 23% require a 2-year degree. Only 2% of local police departments required a 4-year degree. Keep in mind, if you're going to go federal, typically FBI, CIA, etc., they do require a bachelor's degree. And, when asked, most departments expressed a preference for criminal justice majors, usually because that will give the recruit some enhanced knowledge of the criminal justice system and policing, and some of those issues in policing, and even report writing and things like that. So again, a lot of things that really come out of police education. Now, again, most departments also recognize that college education is an important element in the promotion process. And so it really is something that they've started to kind of, understand. And the United States is not alone in this particular thought. Police departments around the world are now encouraging recruits and in-service officers to earn college degrees. So it really is something it's been on the horizon, and it continues to be a promising trend, if you will. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind as we talk a little bit more. And as we look at, well, what are they really kind of requiring, Professor? Well, here's kind of just a little bit of an outline from most agencies around. Now, again, it's not all inclusive, etc. But typically for an officer or deputy, a high school diploma and some college. So, and some agencies require an associate's degree going in. Again, if you're going to go federal, FBI, CIA, usually it's a bachelor's degree in, psychology, criminology, etc. Now, for a sergeant, it's going to be either an associate's degree, and some colleges will basically say, hey, 60 college units or an associate's degree. So some are a little less, and some want that degree in hand. Lieutenant is going to be a bachelor's degree. Captain is going to be a bachelor's degree. If you want to be a chief, it's going to be a master's degree or a PhD. And again, while agencies prefer criminal justice for that degree, it doesn't have to be necessarily in criminal justice. And keep in mind, education is not only good for promotability, but it's also, pay. And some departments offer incentives for a higher education. So it could be 2.5% above your base pay for an associate degree. Another 2.5%, so now you'd be 5% for a bachelor's. Another 2.5%, which now you'd be 7.5% above your base, your base pay for a master's. So there are other incentives, right, that come with having that degree. So before I kind of move on, I wanted to let you know that a while ago, and I'll post a link to this also, back in 2009, our police organization started to shift and really start to push towards education. And so what we thought we would do is we got together with our crime analysis unit, and we thought we would look at agencies within the state of California and some of their requirements for promotion and eligibility, etc. So it was kind of a cool, interesting survey. And one of the biggest things, and again, I'm not going to show you every single page. I'll put a link in here and you can access it. But this is minimum education requirements for an entry-level police officer from 65 different local agencies. Okay. And it really has changed now if you look at the face of it, but you can see the largest portion here was, high school equivalency only. Then you had high school plus, let's say, 15 to 30 semester units. Then you had, the high school equivalency plus 60, or 90 quarter units. Then you had, the high school equivalency plus 2 years of college, okay, which might be the AA degree. You'd have the plus some college classes and, law enforcement. Then you had the AA, the actual AA, and a little bit more. So this was just an interesting little thing, right? So just kind of keep this in mind as we talk more. And when we finish out the semester, the last chapter is going to be covering employment, how to get a job, where to get a job, and all that. And this educational component will fit in to really what we're talking about. And then also, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't talk just a couple of seconds about, when you talk about issues in policing, etc., the different generations of individuals that are coming up, right? So you have, the early traditionalists, the boomers, if you will, the busters, the millennials, the digital generation. So you have, the Gen X, the Gen Y, the Gen Z, etc. And they all kind of, have their own way of thinking, etc. And these are all components that we really have to understand, because this is part of, who are the police, where there's all different types of personalities, etc., perhaps depending upon what decade you were born. And then talking a little bit about some benefits of higher education. Well, it could be better communication with the public, better writers, and this is super important. That's kind of why it's in bold. And then you have a couple of documents here that just show you that in each one of these documents, whether it's the President's Task Force on Policing, some documents put together by PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, or whether it's something done by other organizations, they all point towards, the benefits of higher education for law enforcement. Okay, more likely to be promoted, fewer citizen complaints, more initiative, more professional, and less inclined to use force. And these are just some of those aspects that make higher education really, really important. Keep in mind, when you kind of ask why is it so hard, and we'll cover a lot of this again in our final chapter of the semester, but realistically, when you get down to it, about 1 out of every 100 applicants are going to make it through, because there are challenges. In recruiting, finding qualified applicants became a lot tougher after 9/11 because a lot of folks joined the military. You have negative publicity, especially the media, over high-profile incidents of force or excessive force. Sometimes it's just regular force, meaning that it was justified. Dispelling misconceptions of the job that are, again, caused by the media and even television, and films, etc. You have a new generation of applicants, lack of diversity, sometimes low pay, not in California, but maybe in some other states. Increased educational requirements have sometimes limited that pool of applicants, and you're starting to see the increased educational requirements as we've been talking about. And then, finally, people need to know that this is, it's not just a job, it's a calling. It's long-term, it's tough. So these are all things that are, kind of, as we look back here, some challenges to recruiting. So now let's talk a little bit about minorities in policing. So for some time, U.S. police departments have made a concerted effort to attract minority police officers. And there have been some impressive gains, but we really do have, kind of a long way to go. As might be expected, cities with larger minority populations have a higher proportion of minority officers at their police departments, or typically because the hiring pool is larger. So that kind of makes sense a little bit. And the reasons for this effort are varied. African Americans generally have less confidence in the police. Sometimes they could be more skeptical of their ability to protect citizens from harm. African Americans also seem more likely to have been victimized, possibly, when well-publicized incidents of police misconduct occur. So there might be some kind of hindrances in the perception of policing if you're a minority. But some of the things that can really come out of this, if you will, would be, having better diverse police departments is a better representation of your community as a whole. A lot of times this representation will really help gain the confidence of the community and the minority community. And a lot of, skills that really, things that come with it, some qualities that can improve police performance, specifically Spanish speaking. And undercover officers too, because a lot of times when I ran an undercover unit, you need all different kinds of people, depending upon what type of crime that you're investigating and going to go undercover, right? So if it's a biker gang, you might need, a white person. You might need a female. You might need an African-American person. You might need somebody else. So you need to have a kind of just everybody in order to really make your unit top quality. So you're talking about improving performance. And I really hope that this kind of makes sense. And, kind of really quick, back to Spanish-speaking officers, they can really help. And I had always encouraged a lot of my younger officers to take Spanish classes if they didn't already speak a language, etc., because this can help with investigations, translation, etc. So a lot of really important things that kind of come out of this that we have to understand, that broadening the diversity in organizations is really super beneficial. So again, why might we not have as many minorities in policing? Well, it could be that less confidence in police. It could have been prior negative contacts. But I do know some folks that have joined because of some negative contacts, and they wanted to start to do the right thing and show that the right thing could be done, which is a reason that they got into this particular career path in the first place. So there are, there's some good that comes out of some of this. And then we talk a little bit about the African American, experience. So who you see at the top there on the right is the police chief for the Phoenix, Arizona Police Department, Jerry Williams, who's a good friend of mine. What a fabulous person and a great police chief. And then on the bottom right beneath her photo is Milwaukee Sheriff David Clark, who is another awesome individual. But, think about breaking into the business, if you will, when traditionally a long time ago, right, that typically this was a white kind of male-dominated type career. It's not now, but it was back then. And we have this thing called double marginality. Now, according to Nicholas Alex, the social burden that African-American police officers carry by being both minority group members and law enforcement, makes things, it could be kind of tough, right? So, again, Nicholas Alex pointed out that African-American officers, of the time suffered from what he called this double marginality thing. On one hand, African-American officers had to deal with the expectation that they would give members of their own race a break. On the other hand, they often experienced overt racism from their colleagues. And we're talking a while ago. Alex found that African-American officers, adaptation to these kind of pressures ranged from denying that African-American suspects should be treated differently from whites, to treating African-American offenders with more harshly than white offenders to prove that they didn't have any type of bias. Alex also offered several reasons why some African-American officers, were tougher on African-American offenders. They desired acceptance from their white colleagues. They were particularly sensitive to any disrespect shown them by African-American teenagers. And they viewed themselves as protectors of the African-American community. And ironically, minority citizens may be more likely to accuse a minority officer of misconduct than a white officer, a circumstance that kind of underscores the different position of the minority officer in contemporary society. So, this is, a very interesting dynamic, right? And we have to consider all of the aspects, surrounding these things as we talk about diversity in policing, or actually in any career. So what about representation today? So there's a table that I'll show you in just a minute, which contains the most, up-to-date data as of this textbook, and it illustrates the increasing diversity in America's police departments. Approximately 27% of local police officers are African American, Hispanic, or of other minority races. And the increased representation of minorities in police department ranks has fueled a number of changes, if you will. Minority police officers now seem more aggressive, more self-assured, and less willing to accept any type of discriminatory practice by the police department. And researchers have also found that they are more willing than white officers to use their authority to take official, action, etc. Yet, as their numbers increase, minority officers appear to be experiencing some of the same problems and issues encountered by white officers. They report feeling, similar rates of job-related stress and strain, and stemming from the same types of stressors, such as family conflict and other things. So again, and there's a interesting document published by the U.S. Department of Justice, and it was a little while ago, but it does talk about police personnel practices, hiring, etc. And you can take a look at that if you want to at your leisure, and I put the link down here for you to look at. Out of that report, you can see a couple of kind of charts that I pulled out, if you will, that talk about female representation. And again, this is back in 2013. And then you can also see minority representation among full-time police officers as well. So a little bit of an older document, but it kind of shows you what's been taking place. And here is that chart that I told you that talked about the organization by the population served, if you will, and then breaking it down by different ethnicities, etc. So what about women in policing? In 1910, in Los Angeles, Alice Stebbins Wells became the first woman to hold a title of police officer and to have arrest powers. And there's a little bit of an argument on, historians on who really was the first, but we're going to go with this, okay? And kind of referencing the figure, that chart that I showed you a minute ago, about 15% of all sworn officers in larger cities, which would be over 250,000 folks, officers, are women. And women are more underrepresented in smaller cities and counties. Unfortunately, research suggests that the increase in female representation among sworn officers may be leveling off. I can say, as a police chief who did a lot of hiring, that I did for a while see quite a bit of increase in female officers applying for the job, etc., or female applicants applying for the job. And it was actually kind of continuing when I left law enforcement. From what I understand, there are still a lot of women that are interested in policing, but there are some challenges to overcome as far as recruitment, etc. And the road, to success here in police work really hasn't been easy for women. For more than a half a century, female officers endured basically separate criteria for selection. They were given menial tasks and were denied the opportunity for advancement. And some relief was gained, reference that, with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and its subsequent amendments, etc., but there was still a long way to go. So we know that, they're still struggling for acceptance, higher levels of job-related stress. Many female officers report that policing is male-dominated and not very woman-friendly. And again, I've seen it kind of both ways. I know that there are organizations that are very pro hiring when it comes to females, and I know some that possibly may not be. So it's kind of, it depends where you're at, I guess. Now, with that said, one reason for the lack of acceptance in law enforcement is that many males view policing as an overtly masculine kind of profession. And research indicates that women are highly successful as police officers. An important study from Washington, D.C., their police department, police women were found to be extremely satisfactory in their performance, if not high satisfactory. And women were more likely than males to receive support from the community. On the other hand, there is a little bit of evidence there that female officers are more likely to be assaulted during domestic violence calls. And that's just from one particular study and a little bit of other, research, etc. So, when it kind of comes to women in policing, they are kind of stuck in this, odd catch-22, if you will, right? If they are physically weaker, male partners view them as a risk in street confrontations, but if they are more powerful or aggressive, they're regarded as kind of a threat to that male officer's ego, if you will. So there's a little bit of a catch-22. So finally, one barrier, though, that was found to, that kind of hindered women from considering a career in law enforcement was really the absence of role models or mentors to be able to kind of walk them through the process and show them the ins and outs, etc. I put a little note down there because it's kind of interesting that came out of one particular study that studies show that women are less likely to use force than men. So kind of an interesting study. And, when I was a chief of police, I did recognize that, we were trying to hire more women into our organization. And in order to do that, we actually came up with this was back in 2015, our first women's fitness challenge. So, basically it was only women, no men, and they were able to come and talk to officers, sergeants, lieutenants, administrative staff, female, that could tell them how to navigate through some of the issues in order to get into law enforcement, and to also allow them to test their abilities on the physical fitness front, if you will. So it was a really cool idea back at the time, and I know that several organizations still offer similar things like this in order to attract new recruits, specifically women recruits. I put in a couple of other bits of information that you can look at that shows gender composition in policing, so you can kind of take a look at it at your leisure as well. And this figure was actually out of your textbook. So it talks about female representation, again, back in 2013. Okay, so, despite all these problems, the future of women in policing grows continually brighter. Female officers want to remain in policing because, just like male officers, it pays a good salary, it offers job security, it's challenging, it's exciting, it does have a pretty decent retirement system. And these factors should continue to bring women into policing for the years to come. And again, over my tenure, I've met and, hung out with, if you will, many female administrative staff members, captains, chiefs, commanders, etc. So the future is bright, but again, there still are some hindrances out there when it comes to recruitment. Okay, so now let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little more specifically as it relates to the police profession. So all professions have unique characteristics that distinguish them from other occupations and institutions, right? And policing really is no exception to the rule here. Police experts have long sought to understand the unique nature of the police experience and to basically determine how the challenges of police work shape the profession and its employees. So, when we talk about that, what is this police culture thing? So police experts, again, have found that experience, or the experience of becoming a police officer and the nature of the job itself, cause most officers to kind of band together in a police subculture, if you will, sometimes characterized by cynicism, cliquishness, secrecy, and insulation from others. And that word kind of comes around again, that sometimes they call that the so-called blue curtain or blue wall. And that's the kind of insulated police culture that isolates police from this, the outside society. And we'll talk more about the little picture of the blue line in just a little bit. And people really do have kind of they've been misinformed on really what it stands for, but we'll get to that. Now, again, this unique conglomeration, if you will, of organizational values, beliefs, and expectations that is passed on to new officers in a police organization is called police culture. So, police officers do tend to socialize together and sometimes believe that their occupation kind of cuts them off from relationships with civilians. Now, that's a yes and a no in reality, okay? Because, when I got into law enforcement, I can remember some friends that were friends became not friends, if that makes any sense, because of what I was doing for my career. So sometimes that just kind of naturally happens, specifically if you're going to get into the realm of law enforcement. So kind of keep that in mind. So, again, officers perceive their working environment to be laden with, danger or the risk of danger. They become preoccupied with the personal risks and violence that surround them, always anticipating both. And perceptions of danger have a kind of a unifying effect on officers and work to separate them from the public and help create the boundaries of that police subculture, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing when you think about that. Joining the police subculture means always having to stick up for fellow officers against outsiders, maintaining that tough, macho exterior personality, and distrusting the motives and behaviors of those other outsiders. So, again, because policing is a hazardous job, and the availability of unquestioned support and loyalty of their peers, is not something officers could really do without, right? So that because of the nature of the job, they tend to kind of stick together, if you will. Now, again, nonetheless, some experts fear that the police culture will end up dividing officers from those they serve and kind of create this kind of us versus, them type mentality. So that is a consideration. But let's look now at 6 core beliefs that are viewed as being, at the heart of the police culture. So number 1, police are the only real crime fighters. So the public wants the police officer to fight crime. Other agencies, both public and private, only, kind of play at crime fighting. Next would be, no one else understands the real nature of police work. Okay. Lawyers, academics, politicians, and the public in general have little concept of what it means to be a police officer. And that to some extent really is true. Until you stand in the shoes, you really don't understand. Next, loyalty to colleagues counts above everything else. So police officers have to stick together because everyone is out to get the police and make the job more difficult. So again, these are core beliefs that are viewed as being part of that culture. Next, the war against crime cannot be won without bending the rules. So, basically courts have awarded criminal defendants too many rights. Number 5, members of the public are basically unsupportive and unreasonably demanding. So people are quick to criticize law enforcement unless they, need police help themselves. And then finally, patrol work is kind of the bottom of the rung, if you will, where detective work would be the more kind of glamorous thing. So again, 6 beliefs, that are viewed as being at that heart of police culture. Okay, so kind of continuing on, the forces that support police culture are generally believed to develop out of, kind of a on-the-job experience. And membership in the police culture helps recruits adjust to the rigors of police work and provides the emotional support needed for survival. The culture encourages decisiveness in the face of uncertainty and the ability to make these split-second decisions that may later be subject to extreme criticism. So, kind of in sum, if you will, the police culture has developed in response to the kind of, insulated, dangerous lifestyle of police officers. Policing is a hazardous occupation, and the availability of the unquestioned support and loyalty of their peers is not something officers can readily do without. Nonetheless, again, some experts fear that the police culture will divide those officers from the people that they serve, and we end up again with that us versus them kind of mentality. So, again, all things for us to consider. So, what about police personality? So, along with with an independent police culture, if you will, some experts believe that police officers develop a unique set of personality traits that distinguish them from the average citizen. Now, to some commentators, the typical police personality can be described as kind of dogmatic or authoritarian, and sometimes even suspicious, if you will. And cynicism has been found, at all levels of policing, including chiefs of police and throughout all stages of a police career. And cynicism, by definition, if you don't know, is the belief that most people's actions are motivated solely by personal needs and selfishness. So, again, understanding kind of how police officers are, this working personality, if you will, is shaped again by basically conscious or constant exposure to danger and the need to use force and authority to reduce and control threatening situations. And police feel suspicious of the public they serve and sometimes defensive about the actions of their fellow officers, if you will. And there are basically two opposing views, for the cause of this. One position holds departments attract recruits who by nature are a little bit cynical, and that others maintain that socialization and experience on the force itself causes these characteristics to develop. And I can tell you through experience that a lot of times that sometimes, humor and a little bit of cynicism, etc., is sometimes a coping mechanism for law enforcement to kind of deal with some of the stressors of policing. So that's just kind of my 2 cents in there. But again, we're talking about, personality of law enforcement, etc. And just I threw up a couple of interesting things from the Pew Research Center that talk about that are surveys. Here, the one on the left said, most police say the public doesn't understand the risks. And then on the right, do Americans understand the challenges? And what's kind of interesting, right, when you look at the difference, percentage of public saying that they understand the risks and challenges, but do they really, compared to, what police officers think as well? So it really is an interesting dynamic to kind of look at. Because here, when you look at it, the public says, yeah, we understand the challenges, and the police say, oh no, absolutely not. So, here's the public, and here's what law enforcement thinks. You can see the gap there, right? So there really is a perception gap in there. Okay, so let's finish up now with part 1, and we'll talk a little bit about police styles. So policing encompasses a multitude of diverse tasks, including peacekeeping, criminal investigation, traffic control, even providing medical service. And part of the socialization of a police officer is developing a working attitude or style, if you will, through which he or she approaches policing. And, other officers may see themselves as part of that. We talked about the thin blue line, and that basically, protects the public from the wrongdoers. And that's kind of what the thin blue line really does mean, although others have a different opinion, and that's okay. But, sometimes law enforcement will use any means to get the culprit, even if it involves, kind of bending the rules, if you will. And should the police bend the rules to protect the public? I mean, that is kind of, should they do that? So when we talk about police styles, working personalities adopted by police officers that can range from being a social worker in blue, if you will, solving problems, to being that hard-charging crime fighter. A lot of studies have attempted to define and classify police styles into what we call behavior clusters, if you will. And the purpose of these classifications is to demonstrate that the police are not a cohesive, homogeneous group, as many believe, but individuals kind of with their own differing approaches. And just to kind of add to that, I can remember riding with a partner, the same partner I rode with, and we were in the gang unit at the time, and we had different ways of doing stuff. We were still great partners together, but we did differentiate a little bit in how we kind of did our police work. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic. So it's not necessarily that everybody is the same in the organization, because studies again are showing that police officers kind of have their own way of doing what they're going to do, right? So here are a couple of the police styles, and then we'll take our first break. So we have the crime fighter. And here, and this would be on page 251 in your textbook, most important aspect of police work is investigating the serious crimes and arresting criminals. That's the crime fighter. Then you have the social agent that tends to be more accepting of the social service roles, if you will. Okay, they're the troubleshooters who kind of patch the holes that appear where the social fabric of society tends to kind of wear a little bit thin. Then you have the law enforcer, and this individual treats all the laws and offenders equally. Okay, it's kind of like the facts are the facts, and by the book is by the book, right? So they kind of see themselves as generalized law enforcement officers, if you will. And then finally, the watchman, who basically focuses on the maintenance of public order as the police goal, not necessarily law enforcement or general service. Though the watchman may basically ignore some smaller infractions, etc., and requests for service unless they believe that the social or political order is kind of jeopardized, right? So that's kind of the watchman. So that's going to kind of show some different police styles. And then we'll finish up with that, but I think now's a good time for us to take our first break, and then we'll come back and we'll look at some current views on police culture, a little bit more on personality, and a little bit more on style. So again, this will conclude part 1 of chapter 7, talking about issues in police.